and Madhya distillation down the limit of Masadi Gianchi, to say, but where the Masanchi, and Kikochea, Chinam, Japton, to Shisaripia.
Good evening, and it's good to be together again for our first gathering, our first teaching of the year. And yeah, it feels very good to be back here and back with all of you. So I want to say to everyone, Wom Tashidele.
Lord, can Jesus no so. Jigapan to what in no Japan given what is Shiro to Shit. Yes, Japan,
So the 2 months that I've been away in India, I was able to not only go to my home monastery of Sera, but also to the area that I was born and grew up in the far north of India, in Taiwan. It's been some years since I've been able to visit there, and I was able to see my entire extended family. In fact, we were able to gather together for the first time in many years. Then after returning to Sera, His Holiness had actually come down to a neighboring monastery, Tashi Lumpur, just a few days before, where he was residing for a month. And in this period that he was there, he started taking regular audiences with the extended Tibetan community. So it was divided. Those who could get to see His Holiness was present first those who were oldest, so those above 80 years old. They were given the first opportunity. Then once all the Tibetans, both in the villages in southern India, as well as in the monks and nuns, the monasteries and nunneries, when those over 80 had all had an opportunity to see His Holiness, those over 60 got an opportunity. And as I'm now in that category, I had an opportunity to meet His Holiness directly. And we, again, tonight have an opportunity to gather. And whilst I've had these experiences over the last 2 months, I imagine each of you would have had your own individual experiences over this period. And within that, I'm confident many of you would have continued engaging in your daily meditation practice and reading Dharma texts and so forth. And this, I just want to recognize and acknowledge the very fact that you are using your life in this way really is remarkable. And now on a Wednesday evening, that you choose on a lovely sunny evening to come here and gather together to hear the words of the Dharma, this is something to recognize within yourself, that you've created these precious and rare karmic imprints that have led you to come into contact again in this life with the Mahayana Dharma. So from my perspective, to be gathered together with you in this context brings great joy to my heart. In particular, that we come together to start now the third year of looking at this remarkable Bodhisattva text, Shantideva's Engaging the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. To once again in this life, to be hearing teachings as we slowly move through the progression of meditations that are contained within this jewel of a text, recognize just truly how fortunate we are So at the start of this now, third year on this text, regenerates the motivation of the Bodhisattva, which is through hearing these teachings and integrating them into our heart, may we develop spiritually in order to be able to guide each and every mother sentient being. So ourselves and each being without exception, guide them to a state freed of suffering. To generate now, at the start of our year together, the motivation of a Bodhisattva.
All the ne down through ne I wish I can do it. Yeah, come here, yeah, no, and it keeping each of the shoes, headers, but the shoes from your shoes, not yet, and you find shit, and you share, yeah, we ask them. I think you talk about it, and you talk it up, and that channels at that some diet. No.
I also want to acknowledge that in this period, you also requested one of my remaining teachers, one of my textual teachers from the monastery, Venerable Lobsang Dorje, to write a long life prayer for myself. So I just want to acknowledge that and say this is not something that we necessarily need to recite as a community after every teaching, but from time to time, and approach it with the attitude that this is an opportunity to create merit. So I recognize that this is a heartfelt request from your side, and thereby each time it is recited, you will accumulate merit through doing so.
And you Johan Yogadza, that the hotter Pachman Bituka, Razma, Shen Sindham, the Devata Kuhant, Chiba Dara, Senja Gamje, Nesani, Sanki Pu, Wata, Jesate, Eliza, Senja, Vitia Sanji, who want to be chipped to Lechakara, Abachip share in BJ. Rahachimi said, Jajism in your touch, Chidisi Cheba, Holodichi, at then and then chase it, the cyber come to it's a ye and the river did that, but she should be in a new river. Sunko, it is a yeah, the chest.
Now, as we embark once again on engaging in this great text of the Mahayana Dharma, we remind ourselves of the essential motivation of the Mahayana, which comes about through the recognition that I do not want to suffer. I only want to experience happiness. And in this, I'm no different from anyone else in our room, in my family, anyone I've ever known, in fact, any being, anywhere. All of us, on this fundamental level, are the same. We just want to abide in happiness. And the greatest happiness is the happiness of a Buddha, the lasting, stable happiness of a Buddha that's never punctuated by even the slightest of suffering, and being a being who can be of real meaningful benefit to others. So this is the goal to strive for, to eventually become a Buddha for the sake of others. And to do so, we need to have as a clear motivation behind receiving this teaching, meditating on its meaning, and all our activities to be focused on initially becoming a Bodhisattva, and then crossing through the various paths and then grounds of the Bodhisattva, eventually crossing to the far shore of enlightenment.
That loves you, love you, do you win? I show listen, like any sim, yes, sim, yes, none, a sim, a sim soon said the galaxy, a young over short, like Carpashi, sim, you should not, yes, sense of the yes, sense already, and it can school of Japan, Shishi, Gagin, Yoshiki, USA, and in that Shishi, you hold, Jan Shishi, you connect, soon collide the same track. Sensually, Tata Shishi, who said it to support it.
where we've come to in the text is near the beginning of the 5th chapter. So our journey to come to the 5th chapter started first with this text of looking at the qualities of bodhicitta to give rise to a deep yearning inside to become a bodhisattva for the sake of all beings. Thereafter, the 2nd and 3rd chapters were about preparing the mind in order to generate bodhicitta. And this is done through the process of accumulating virtue or wholesome ways of thinking and purification, purifying unwholesome ways of thinking. So those were the 2nd and 3rd chapters. Then we came to the trainings in the 4th and now the 5th chapter, which are about guarding this precious mind. This precious mind, whatever, whether it is in the mind of actual bodhicitta or the aspiration to become a bodhisattva, the aspiration to eventually generate bodhicitta, to guard this virtuous mind and all other virtuous minds. And in order to be able to guard the mind, one needs to rely on various pivotal minds, such as conscientiousness, the 4th chapter, and now in the 5th chapter, mindfulness and vigilance. And the 5th chapter is in particular entitled Vigilance or Introspection. So this is the journey that we've progressed along to this point. What we've addressed thus far has included that the recognition of what is virtuous and what is non-virtuous, and both virtue and non-virtue, virtuous activities of physical behavior and of speech, come about independent on the preceding or the motivating mind, which is going to be respectively virtuous or non-virtuous. So therefore, if one wants to abandon all forms of non-virtuous physical activity or speech, one needs to abandon non-virtuous ways of thinking. Or to express that differently, one needs to abandon the afflictions, because it's through afflicted minds that we engage in non-virtuous speech or physical behavior. And the way to abandon non-virtuous minds is to develop contrary minds, opposing minds, which are necessarily virtuous. So by strengthening virtuous ways of thinking, we naturally weaken and will eventually abandon non-virtuous ways of thinking. This is the approach to take. And most recently in the text, right at the beginning of the 5th chapter, an analogy, or the mind was compared to an elephant. So if we think in particular, in ancient times, a wild elephant, an untamed elephant, could do so much harm to a village. Coming out from the jungle, it could destroy crops that villagers labored by hand to grow. And this untamed elephant could even destroy homes, and of course could destroy life. So this untamed elephant was likened to an untamed mind, because the untamed or unsubdued mind, this can do grave destruction. And in fact, if one makes a direct comparison between an untamed mind and an untamed elephant, the mind can do far worse harm, because it can lead to suffering not just in this life, but lives to come. And an elephant cannot do that. But this analogy had a second meaning, that this powerful untamed mind that can do such harm can also be developed into a powerful virtuous mind that can do incredible good. So the analogy still stands of the mind being likened to a powerful elephant, but if turned to virtue, it can accumulate extensive merit and lead to the engaging in activities that bring great benefit to not just oneself, but to a vast number of beings. So we possess the capacity, it's within our own hands, that we can tame or subdue this powerful mind that we have, likened here to an elephant. It's a mind that has the capacity to do grave harm, to subdue it. So that this powerful mind becomes a mind solely of virtue. So therefore, in this context of in the 4th chapter, conscientiousness, now the 5th chapter on vigilance, we subdue the mind by tying it to virtue, and we guard the mind from going in the direction of the afflictions or non-virtue by keeping the mind virtuous. So that, in brief, is the overview of where we've come to up to this point. This particular Bodhisattva training that the text is presenting here in the 4th and 5th chapter is guarding the mind. The Bodhisattva, for the Bodhisattva, this is a pivotal training to guard the mind. And how is this done? Through conscientiousness, vigilance, and mindfulness. Hence, we are now on the chapter of vigilance or introspection. So here what we need to be very clear on, and it's something that's come up many times in the text, is that all non-virtue that any being accumulates comes through the mind being non-virtuous. So either if it's a mental activity or a vocal expression, a verbal expression, or a physical activity, it's all directed from the mind. And this is the case for both non-virtue as well as virtue. When this is seen, and this is truly understood, it becomes very clear I need to take care of my mind. This is indispensable. Moreover, from the Dharma perspective, the rebirth that we have experienced in the past and we will experience in lives to come are come about in dependence on the karma that we have created, which comes about in dependence on our way of thinking, our mind. Therefore, if our mind is non-virtuous, we will accumulate the seeds, the karmic seeds, that if they ripen in a propelling karma can only lead to rebirth in the lower realms, as an animal, as spirit, or in the hells. But if we recognize that, we should also recognize that if our mind is virtuous, those karmic imprints, should they ripen as propelling karma, will lead to an excellent rebirth, a rebirth as a human or as a god, and they will lead to the accumulation of causes that will enable our ongoing progression towards liberation from suffering in its entirety, or even the state of Buddhahood. So whatever trajectory our life takes, whether it's one of happiness coming from virtue, or suffering and pain and misery coming from non-virtue, whatever direction our lives take comes from our mind. So therefore, through this recognition, we strive to ensure that our mind is not under the influence of the afflictions, that as soon as we recognize their arisal, we abandon them. And should they arise, we don't let them influence us, but we rather abandon them. And at the same time, we ensure that our mind stays virtuous, and thereby we habituate our mind to the virtuous minds of the Dharma. So this, in brief, is the meaning of the Dharma. It's training your mind to become ever less habituated to the afflictions and ever more habituated to the various topics of the Dharma. From what I've been presenting thus far, the pivotal role our mind plays should be abundantly clear. We should really take this to heart, this understanding that when our mind is virtuous, in other words, when our mind is not at all afflicted, but rather wholesome minds are dominant, this will have an impact on our facial expression, our way of interacting with others, the way we speak towards others. So if our mind is joyous and light, we'll engage with others in that way. you'll move through society with a mind that is light and joyous, and we'll bring happiness into the lives of others. But so too, if our mind is dark, if our mind is upset, this we will show to others. Our facial expression, the tone of our voice, the volume of our voice will all give away the state of our mind. And from this, we will have an impact on others. Here, especially as those who aspire to enter into the paths of the Bodhisattva, we have an appreciation that we have an impact on others. So we should be very clear that what is it that has an impact on others is our mind. So therefore, by taking care of our mind, we take care of how we engage with others. If we are careless with our mind, then who knows how we're going to interact with others. But we know from what we've observed from ourselves and what we see elsewhere, that when the mind is afflicted, the way of speaking, the way of acting, all too often brings harm and brings pain to all involved. So this is something that we can recognize. So I encourage you to take this to heart, to really recognize the primacy of mind, so that in your training, you come to watch your mind, not just in meditation, not just at quiet times such as when hearing teachings, but at all times be aware of your mind and ensure that the afflictions do not destroy your own happiness, nor that the happiness of those around you. When you watch your mind, become familiar with your mind, you come to recognize the impact that the afflictions have on you, you will see that merely the rise of afflictions in your mind destroys your own peace of mind. So you may have been in an excellent mood, but then you get annoyed. All that's happened is an affliction has arisen, but your joy is gone. In particular, if it's strong or it's abiding, it's going to be expressed to those around you. They'll recognize that once again you're in a bad mood, and they'll be fearful around you. You may not have said or done anything, but you have earned a reputation. So in this way, our afflictions not only harm us and harm us with ease, but those around us. And those of us here perhaps have some influence over those in our immediate orbits. With those in society who have more power, whether they are positions of authority in their place of work or in governments, their state of mind has a far greater reach. So when you observe the world today, when you think of what we know of history, when someone with power and influence, when their mind is dominated by the afflictions, this has a far-reaching impact. So we can't do very much about the state of mind of world leaders, certainly not those from the history books, but we can take that as inspiration to take care of our own mind. And likewise, where there are people in the world today, or who have lived in past times, who had a great positive impact, there we can see the converse situation, that where a mind is dominated by good qualities such as love, compassion, and wisdom, not only is that individual far happier, but those in their immediate orbit benefit from their presence. In fact, people may go on pilgrimage to their places they abided just to try and feel some of their presence. And through their subdued mind, their transformed mind, they have been able to have far-reaching beneficial impact on others. In particular, where they've been able to guide others in the accumulation of virtue. Furthermore, as Buddhist practitioners, we have the aspiration to accumulate causes to ensure further excellent rebirths and to progress towards liberation and enlightenment. So you need to be very clear that those goals come about independent on virtuous ways of thinking. Afflictions create causes for their opposite results. Afflictions keep one bound in samsara. Afflictions lead one to fall to the lower realms. So whatever Dharma goal you aspire to, whatever form of mental state you wish to develop within yourself, be very clear. All that's standing in your way is the dominance of the afflictions in your mind. By eradicating your mind of the afflictions, you will be developing the desired good qualities. So I say this to you as spiritual practitioners, recognize the afflictions as being the true bearer of harm in your life and through you to others too. So take care of your mind, guard your mind from the afflictions. The process of spiritual development comes down to transforming our mind itself. And this is done through both developing habituation to wholesome ways of thinking and thereby weakening our habituation to unwholesome or afflicted ways of thinking. This, in brief, is the process of how we transform our mind, which is through developing virtuous habituations and weakening and eventually breaking non-virtuous habituations. And to do so, vigilance is indispensable. Vigilance is a mind, a consciousness that observes the mind itself. It observes, you could say, the color of the mind. It observes whether the mind is afflicted or virtuous. So vigilance plays this role of being in the background, watching the mind. And as soon as it notices that the mind is either once again afflicted or is staying on the side of virtue, its close companion of mindfulness plays its part. Mindfulness is maybe better or more literally translated as recollection, or in other contexts is a word for memory. So when vigilance notices that the mind is, for example, virtuous, mindfulness will recognize the benefits of a virtuous mind, and this will give you positive encouragement. Similarly, when vigilance notices that the mind is afflicted, mindfulness recalls the faults of the afflictions. Mindfulness will then recall the antidotes to apply. So if vigilance notices, for example, that self-interest is strong, and it's being expressed as a miserliness, vigilance will notice this. Mindfulness will then remind you of the faults of self-interest. In particular, someone who aspires to the Bodhisattva path, someone who aspires to cherish others first and foremost. Then mindfulness will turn your mind to generosity, an outward, a mind that wants to give of oneself to others. So this is how these crucial minds of vigilance or introspection and mindfulness work together. And these two are indispensable to transform the mind, to strengthen the habituation to wholesome ways of thinking and break the holds the afflictions still have on us. So we use these two, mindfulness and vigilance, to focus on our state of mind and ensure it stays wholesome.
Then so sinh hiện nó chỉ kế rủi ro cả nó tham chế tạo甚至于风暴大以前嘛这些生活吧。
So now we turn to the text, starting where the new verse where we concluded last time, which is the 4th verse in the 5th chapter. Tigers, lions, elephants, bears, snakes, and all other enemies, the guardians of those beings in hell, sorcerers, and likewise rakshas, and so forth. Then you simple young me mayina nikane. So this 4th verse follows on from the preceding verse, the third verse, which I'll just read. If from all sides the rope of mindfulness firmly binds the elephant's mind, all terrors and fears will cease to be, and all virtue will come into our hands. So this preceding verse made the point that through binding the mind, which is likened here to an elephant, with that rope of mindfulness, we can include their vigilance, then all terrors and fears will cease to be, and all virtue will come into our hands. So here, in this now fourth verse, we see illustrations of terrors and fears. So the first line, and the tigers, lions, elephants, bears, and snakes. This, of course, refers to potential sources of fear and terror in this life. Those animals that can cause us terror and fear, as well as other sources of fear in this life, as we have there in the second line, and all other enemies. So there we can understand to be referred to humans. So animals and humans that can cause us fear. The third line refers to future lives, the fears of being born in hell, where one will be tormented by guardians of the hells. And then the fourth line again refers to non-humans. So what are translated as sorcerers can be better translated than as evil influences, but it refers to non-humans who can cause us harm, and rakshas are also non-humans who eat flesh and drink blood. So this fourth verse then presents illustrations of those that can cause terror and fear. We can take him in any. So the fourth verse then presents a variety of sources of terror, those relating to this life and future lives, those from the animal realm, those from the human realm, those from the hell realms, and those from the spirit realms. All are presented here, or illustrated here in the fourth verse. So these are linking again to the third verse, these are sources of terror and fear that we want to be freed from. And how so? Now moving to the fifth verse, look at the first two lines. By binding this mind alone, they all without exception become bound. So what the fifth verse then starts to present is that every terror and fear, or all forms of suffering that are experienced, that ever have been and ever will be, come about independent on causes. In other words, the karmic causes that we have created, together with the ripening afflictions that ripen that negative karma, this is what leads to our suffering. So here again we see the pivotal role the mind has played in creating the negative karma that leads to suffering, the afflictions that ripen those karmic imprints. But if we bind our mind, so the first line in the fifth verse, by binding this mind alone, binding the mind to virtue. So we can imagine if someone or something is bound to a pillar or a stake in the ground, it cannot go anywhere. it is bound to that pillar, bound to that stake. So if we bind our mind to virtue, then our mind will not be creating the causes for suffering, but we'll only be creating causes for happiness. So this then is by binding this mind alone, they all without exception become bound.
像这身的几个大半夜，身几个大这个也是的，身几个大些的的，他们也信息的讲大把蛮是身几个大些的，身几个给一个的大，给我来三大，几个大不是现在这个大不嘛的是个的话，身几个大呢这个的是现在这个大不啊的是，现在大我们的开始大深夜他发现与把这。但是也有数码大企业的，是我这个大我妈的说的。但是在都目前的，那个给我的，那我是怕家大给大里许多了大的些怕大主意大车上来我不是没有说主要朋友们玩或对，因为那我是心怕他不是怕家大下班呢，说你那个有嘛的，这个的些大下班呢，怕大下班呢，不然那个那样嘛。那人过我等一下就是大我妈的，好多还我的这个是我是他大菜哦吧，这里变好什么？人家而且我是说先结果给月生怕，而且因为当然上的先用我们说好大，有说了个一个大宝的是大事的，一个这个大事的大事的你俩给我写，然后的那是不是大事？等到你到了的，等到了个个心里好像也上到，因为也没看见结果也说，都是那个人们这些白了，那心结果到吧，给大人，也让他们到本不是的，实际上弄不起来，几个人呢讲讲这个，也是比说那个这个有嘛不买给吧，在人嘛少吧，应当，那说的那个几个让不起来大，那是主要的，一家话吧，那是你有什么的。用嘛是扩大小个基本人是，大伙用是扩大小基本人是，很多人对于个哎呦，是的。
These first two lines show very clearly the Buddhist approach to gaining freedom from terrors and fears, or freedom from suffering, which is to radically transform your mind, your inner world. There's no need to radically transform the outer world. One needs to change one's mind within. By binding this mind alone, so again, this is referring to binding the mind to virtue. In other words, that the mind is continuously virtuous. In this way, they all, without exception, will become bound. What this is making clear is, in reality, we cannot eradicate all animals that may bring harm, all spirits, the lower realms, and so forth, as well as other humans who may bring harm. We cannot eradicate all of them, remove them from our space. But what we can do is eradicate the possibility of ourselves suffering in relation to them. And we do so by binding our mind to virtue. And if we, through training our mind in virtue, so that it is truly bound to virtue, we will not experience suffering at the hands of tigers, lions, elephants, and so forth, because we have not created those causes to be harmed by them. So therefore, there is no need to change our outer world. We solely need to change our own mind.
你说这之类的吧，可能我先大那两步去，那现在是如公布的话，当然是那也是的，可能另外呢，也那少很多啊，很多澳大利亚人是大吧，现在大，那这个蛮原来这些蛮多人嘛，是没多啊，今年不能那个人呢，刚好这些那是很多啊，是有多的，那比如原来那个不能就是。
So don't be too limited by the literal interpretation here, thinking, well, I live in Australia, no tigers here, no lions, no elephants, no bears. Well, there are some snakes, but we don't see them that often. And if I stay away from the zoo, well, then I'm definitely not going to be harmed by any of these animals. So this would really be a wrong way to approach this verse.
也需要的信誉。是的，那个上班嘛，个这些上班打西安帮我这公务修的，证明他们到公务吧。你些我在这家一点些个了顺这个什么那公务的不的，那样啥的能到把到外面有哈。一年也是叫了这个送一个学生啥的亚大少，亚大少的，这边我上当了第几个车位，送是语言的学术语吧的。兄弟个比语训的肯定是数学吧，一旦你的宝贝都是根本嘛哇，也实际上给你一个fon色的你家上班的，等那个数学个不啦，那怎么的那不的，学习下来学语嘛哇，实际语的也跑不得哩，你跑不得，你这个么家多的，你是现在办啊多，你也的，你语不了去呢，哇，大是一点点那个是一样。我有一男的那几说，有些包括用过，一年上一年牙可是太多，那么是忙不的没水了，靠对的认到出来，忙不有我的，忙进来是那么钱，很多是离不，现在今年的利益个别，很多给切里去，有些好的嘛，很多可能就比我讲可说的我原来的好不切的。这个不肯说，这是了，大生意他这边觉得有本事过的也是，所以这点是吧？这家就是有了什么样的养生点没个别，安吉你去把的也好个 floss 你的那风味那的那么是的，大生意大把数，反正现在数。
And also in our world, there aren't many places where one is in danger from tigers, lions, elephants, bears, and snakes. So the way to approach verses such as this, but really it's relevant to all the Dharma, is to use your intelligence and not to take a teaching, a text literally, but think through its meaning. This, of course, was composed 1400 years ago in India. So there, the context of ancient India is the context in which this text was composed. At that time, when walking from your residence to another village, a neighboring village, one would have passed through forests. Those forests would have had dangers such as these. These were very relevant and real in the lived experience of people who were receiving this teaching originally. And in fact, even in modern day Indian villages, there are many that are still subjected to the potential danger from elephants and leopards in particular. So it's not completely ancient history in this part of the world. But of course, where we are here in Australia, this is all quite alien, but which should be understood, though, in the correct context.
得到了，那就是必须的必须上的，就是那必须上面找到的那个情况，我觉得啊，去路比情况，路数比情况。年龄比起吧，那个按这个毛数比起吧，那说是我吧，那等于讲啥呢？那这个那这个做到啊，这个生理用路比他们的生理用路吧，用路不往个那来啥的来那个是，你啥是公布的给我来用的，你那个也是那个很多的可是，这种用路对生理用路比说啥呢？啥吧是，这里有些的我也是。以前的给月说的这样三大节，以给我年的七百呢，牛我别说真的阿叔给我这样三百万呢，也有些个有两一些有别的赛道，八十万的，的呢有些个个安提不提我买的，我都行啊，给我的，是几乎到把的给他都是。
In the Australian context, one is more likely to think about fears in relation to bushfires and floods and other natural disasters, or elsewhere in the world, violence sprung from warfare. So all forms of terror and fear come from karma that has been created under the influence of the afflictions. In other words, comes from the causes created by the mind. So if one starts to bind one's mind ever more to virtue, one creates powerful causes of virtuous karma. Therefore, there will be no need to fear suffering, because one is radically transforming one's mind.
Now, in the Sendhi Chibu, doing not the daddy the two shubus. Is our Sendhi Chibu do enough? Man to get the niggy, they say, Marabi, Zumaya Kichada, Zumaya, Reset. Sendhi Chibu do it up.
The fifth verse concludes with, by subduing this mind alone, they all, without exception, become subdued.
Send Chibu dinner to you, say down to you, and same Chibu to see, same day, up to you, Rasanet, the Kawachi training, and she has the same day you about the Shishi thing in the Jamini on the Chancho send, Chancho send you, see you, Tony. And the tree and the done about combat to be shut up on Gomio, send the young or Tanjeta, Jay, young or Susan, Bumby, or do, I would say, do, say the young shut down, guide out that. You know, pass like Sheba, do, I send do, yes, seem cheap good. In it, you order, and it are country to Lord City, and it the tea on the sujet, you go the media never, you get so jet. My and then to me about and the to me so that to see you about that idiot with my own self. That's true. True. Appreciate that. Is it? Come on, you betcha. Yes.
So in the first two lines, we have the word binding, and the third and fourth line, we have subduing. So by binding the mind to virtue, one subdues the mind. So what does subduing in particular then mean? So it's through relying on this trilogy or these three minds of conscientiousness, mindfulness, and vigilance. Through relying on those three, one develops wholesome, virtuous ways of thinking, definite emergence, developing that into love and compassion, as well as in conjoining it with the wisdom realizing emptiness. This is how the mind then is subdued. So first, through good qualities such as definite emergence, love, and compassion, the afflictions become subdued or overwhelmed. And eventually, through the wisdom realizing emptiness, the afflictions become eradicated, and the mind then is completely subdued. So again, it's through developing good qualities that the afflictions are first overwhelmed. This is how a mind is subdued, and eventually eradicated, and then the mind is completely subdued.
Sinishiko Dulce, the Deva Terra Dulce, at Dulcin that I was troops in Mahoma, so did today. Yeah, is that a sin to Sidu, Saint Chibutu, and as an sin to Hana said too. That's in the two said that I'm Cindy, and Sapa, Treasure, and then my dear teacher, and the Sinchi. 也是日语这什么也是什么技术需求吧，都给我讲给人的这个前提讲，技术上的那个是吧，88因为都是给人的这基本这边什么都得人家这人家干的话都会写了，广东从面3几月生意有没有把下来这个什么太阳的深度啊噻，深度是深的，看那个很不难没啊，你给我猜的。用米出嘅造一辆车好了，但是都操，我放假去搞，我操，语言去操这都，两个马上的操吧。因那个操呢，咱是咸鱼，因为咸鱼因为嘅都冇用嚟嘅呢，沙巴咩巴子，咩巴子等基本探知告诉我哋，一家就做有些嘅嘅啦，你把处理个深夜的老说法。你也什么啰嗦？你那个也是才会去干嘛？哎，那样，其实没有错，没tout懂的，也是来没来唱，也是。
So this term here translated as subduing, and the fourth line become subdued. This is a future tense term. So this is something to aspire to do, to strive rather, not aspire to strive to do. So mind that is not subdued is a mind that is stirred up. A mind is stirred up because of afflictions such as pride, arrogance, harmful intent, and so forth. But when the mind is subdued, it is done so through the development of wholesome minds, love, compassion, ethical restraint, generosity, patience, the wisdom realizing emptiness, and so forth. These subdue or pacify the mind. They subdue the mind from the influence of the afflictions. In other words, it's not stirred up, but rather subdued. And a subdued mind is a virtuous mind, a non-afflicted mind. For such a mind, it would be as if tigers, lions, elephants, bears, snakes, and so forth didn't exist around them. Not that the physical being did not exist, but the potential of harm and fear in relation to them, that has been eradicated.
那的人有我的要白讲啊，是那个政府也是的，他们的生意呢，你说了要到，也是我搞到吃亏是，不但的呀，白个，你看，可是不了的，应该想，这新这个，要我的应该说是这个加到农业，今年的我们跑我说是一节方面，因为有工资呢的，应该是在空业的，很把给我是因此，不嘛是的，第一是一个。Ami itu sih set. Dia dan mesnya ini satu tu ayu archie. Asanya betul wala ini aja is saja. Dia aja so cibil no sama the structure. Isal adiwas lucis. Dia yo issue connection lo so issue me sebesar mai. Andusin sama jahil. 这不也是不大，在这下个东西的里面，你的两个他的这个，这一起说给人家说的，但是跟我那俩就你那家去约，你给人家都不是说的，现在这什么现嘛就像刚刚也给不是什么其实是什么什么都学习结巴些，我必须得我那是骗你讲好，就自己什么东西。按一起去过的是，什么程度的生活开始？那个讲呢，在那去你大家呢，比不什么없이确实，也得理解什么忙，或者忙呢，这你那么是必定呢，什么比较要可以嘛的，现在至于什么，现在了解，你什么有点包括也是，真的是好的。
To summarize what we've looked at, it's imperative that we guard our mind, protect our mind. We guard our mind from anything that will draw us away from virtue. We protect our mind, protect it so that it remains within virtue. The virtues will refer to the various virtuous minds of the Dhamma, these that we try and cultivate here when we're hearing teachings, when you're reading Dhamma books, and when you're doing your own daily meditation, generating refuge, turning our mind to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, opening ourselves to their guidance, and developing that commitment to turn to the teachings of the Buddha for happiness rather than turning elsewhere. Moreover, develop in love and compassion for others, develop the genuine wish, may all beings abide in happiness. May we all be free of suffering. In this way, we develop love and compassion for all beings. Then express that in your meditation with the commitment, I will only benefit others, and I will not harm others. From this point forward, I will ensure that at the very least my physical behavior brings no harm to others, but I will also watch my speech to make sure that brings no harm to others. And where I can physically help others or verbally help others, I will do so. And I will train my mind. I'll train my mind. Whilst I cannot promise to be free of afflictions, I'll strive to reduce their influence. So this is a commitment we can make and repeat this every day. And at least as a mental aspiration, hold out the goal of Buddhahood. Make at least on a mental level, the commitment I will become a Buddha so as to help all beings gain freedom from suffering. And then reflect briefly on the 6 perfections, on ethics, on generosity, on patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. And try and then take this brief reflection and relate it to your actual daily lived experience. Recall things that happened the previous day or earlier in that day, and recall where others perhaps criticized you or looked down at you or maybe spoke to you in an unkind way. And if, to the extent that you are developing the Dharma within you, you will be able to relate to such events in a different way, seeing that how others relate to you as not being that important. What is of far greater importance is one's response. Thereby in your meditation, work through a skillful response, not responding in kind, but rather recognizing that beings who give us a hard time, they only want to be happy, just like me. And just like I want to be liked and respected, so too do they. And therefore, rather, in your meditation, work out skillful ways to respond to only help others in response to their harm.
အနေနဲ့ဒီနေ့ဆိုတော့မတို့စနေဒီစားစင်တီဆွန်ဘူးရဲ့ဆက်ကစင်တာအခုကျလေဒီရှိကတာကြောင့်စင်မီခေါ်မယ်အချစ်စမပါရရှိခေါ်မယ်အန်စီယူရင်းရုပ်ကနေရှန်နေဝကန်ချီကိုစမပါရစတာဘေရရှယ်ရလူရင်းရုပ်ကဒီရှယ်ရခက်ပါကဲစစဒီနေ့စမလာရဒီကျေပတ်ချေဦးရှင်လေစမဒီချေဦးရာအစပတ်မရှိsome of the dish corrigible ya was some of the start do we have seen secret how go you do ye how body in on you get that's some ya in this start is simple I'm on that the she might get well she said maybe how get how check what then she in on the gain that's it I would about it it's just on at simple something that it didn't of end the run you can check on the that is the change it might hear some she who's some ya to a cold horse it's not for you check 这个是大概some of the do it is sometimes do and you I'll go to that check it is channel some but okay I'll go max pass then give it your premise of the some of the handy some of you said how one you should check it that efficiency in the check up should check up for that each book check.
What you've heard about tonight and will keep hearing is the need to guard one's mind as well as how to do so. And this really comes down to using vigilance, intentionally being aware of your thought process, developing the habituation of looking inward and not being overwhelmed continuously by the outer world. So this is quite difficult to do at first, but in your quiet time, such as now, or on your meditation seat, watch your mind and ensure it is bound to virtue, and notice when it drifts to afflicted ways of thinking. Bring it back to using mindfulness. And to encourage yourself in this, keep reminding yourself when your mind is in the direction of the afflictions, this is creating the causes for suffering. This is creating the causes that impede your spiritual development, your attainment of your desired spiritual goals. This impedes the benefits you can bring to others. Likewise, when you notice your mind is virtuous, when introspection or vigilance notices the mind is virtuous, use mindfulness to remind yourself, this is the path to happiness. This is the path by which I will attain my spiritual goals, and I will be of ever greater benefit to others. So in this way, utilize conscientiousness, vigilance, and mindfulness continuously, in particular in these quiet times, so as to create the habituation. Because this is quite new, becoming very aware of our inner world and less caught up in the outer activities. But take confidence that through habituation, it becomes easier. This is why Shantideva has devoted many verses to these topics of conscientiousness, vigilance, and mindfulness. And slowly, by going through these teachings and continuing the meditations, this will start to become a habit for you, become part of who you are. So thank you. We'll conclude there for tonight. Thank you. But if you have some questions, we're a few minutes early, so please feel free to ask. Then thank you. And thank you.